At the family's Easter gathering, my table had "the failure" written on it. But I had a revelation that would change the course of the night. At the family's Easter gathering, my table had "the failure" written on it. But I had a revelation that would change the course of the night. I smoothed down my pale blue dress as I walked up the cobblestone path to Victoria's sprawling colonial home. The early spring air carried the scent of lilacs from the perfectly manicured garden. I'd spent hours selecting this outfit, wanting to look put together for once in front of my sister's critical gaze. "Margaret!" Victoria called from the doorway, her voice carrying that familiar forced cheerfulness. "You're actually on time!" I smiled, clutching the homemade carrot cake I'd stayed up until midnight perfecting. "Happy Easter, Vicky," she air-kissed, both my cheeks careful not to smudge her immaculate makeup, and took the cake with a quick glance. "Oh, how quaint. We have a bakery spread already, but I'm sure someone might want this too." I swallowed the familiar sting and followed her into the house that had been our parents' before Victoria and Richard had graciously taken over after Mom and Dad passed. The renovations had erased almost every trace of our childhood home, everything sleek, modern, and impersonal now. The house bustled with activity. My niece Amber was arranging flowers while my nephew Jonathan lounged on the sofa, engrossed in his phone. Richard stood by the bar, already pouring himself a whiskey at barely noon. "Margaret," he nodded, not bothering to cross the room. "Drink?" "Just water for now, thanks." Victoria was already placing my cake far back on the kitchen counter behind the elaborate store-bought desserts. "We're eating in 20 minutes. The Hendersons and Blakes are joining us." My stomach tightened. More witnesses. Victoria always invited her country club friends to family gatherings, as if our family alone wasn't enough. "Can I help with anything?" I asked, trailing behind Victoria as she flitted around the kitchen. "No need. The caterers have it under control." She barely looked at me. "Why don't you just go find your seat in the dining room? Everything's all arranged." I nodded and made my way to the formal dining room where crystal glasses sparkled in the sunlight streaming through the bay windows. The table was a vision of pastel Easter perfection, elaborate flower arrangements, hand-painted china, and personalized place cards at each setting. I walked slowly around the table, looking for my name. Victoria had seated me at the very end, as far from her seat at the head as possible. I reached for the elegant cream-colored card with delicate calligraphy. My heart stopped. Instead of Margaret, the card simply read, "The Failure." My fingers trembled as I picked it up, turning it over as if there might be some explanation on the back. Nothing. Just those two cruel words staring back at me. A lifetime of memories crashed down like a wave. Victoria's smug smile when she got into Princeton while I stayed home to care for our father after his stroke. Her wedding to Richard where she'd introduced me to everyone as her spinster sister. The condescending tone whenever she spoke about my modest apartment or my work at the local library. "Oh, you found your seat already." I turned to see Victoria's daughter Amber, her blonde hair falling in perfect waves just like her mother's. She glanced at the card in my hand, her eyes widening slightly before her expression shifted to something unreadable. Did you see what this says?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Amber's gaze dropped to the floor. "I'm sure it's just Mom's weird sense of humor, Aunt Margaret. You know how she gets when she's stressed about entertaining." "This isn't humor, Amber. This is cruel." She shifted uncomfortably. "I should go help with the flowers. The centerpiece doesn't look right." She hurried away, leaving me standing alone with the offensive card still clutched in my hand. More guests were filtering in. I could hear Victoria's performative laughter from the foyer as she greeted the Hendersons. I should leave. I should walk out that door and never come back. But where would I go? Back to my empty apartment? This family, despite everything, was all I had left. Found your place card, I see." Richard's voice came from behind me, the smell of whiskey preceding him. Victoria thought you'd appreciate the joke. I turned to face my brother-in-law. A joke. He shrugged, smirking slightly. Oh, come on, Margaret. Don't be so sensitive. It's Easter. Lighten up. Lighten up about being called a failure by my own sister? Richard took another sip of his drink. It's not like it's not true, is it? 58 years old, never married, no kids, still renting that same apartment, working at the library shelving books. He leaned closer. Meanwhile, look at what Victoria's built. Look at our kids. I felt like I'd been slapped. I gave up everything to take care of Mom and Dad. Victoria was off building her perfect life while I was emptying bedpans and managing medications. Ancient history, Margaret. It's been, 7 years since they passed? And you're still exactly the same. Victoria swept into the room then, directing caterers where to place the elaborate dishes. Oh, good. You two are catching up. Margaret, why don't you put that place card down and help me with the napkins? I stared at my sister. At her expensive highlights, her designer dress, her diamond-encrusted watch. And something inside me shifted. The hurt was still there, burning like acid in my chest. But something else was rising too. Something that had been dormant for a very, very long time. Victoria, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. What is this? I held up the card. She glanced at it dismissively. Oh, honestly, Margaret, it's just a little joke. Don't make a scene in front of our guests. A joke, I repeated. You think it's funny to call your sister a failure? The sister who gave up her career, her relationships, her entire life to care for our parents while you were off playing society wife? Victoria's expression hardened. That was your choice, Margaret. Nobody forced you to stay. And frankly, using that as an excuse for why your life hasn't amounted to anything is getting rather old. The room went quiet. I realized the Hendersons and Blakes had entered and were watching our exchange with uncomfortable fascination. Jonathan had looked up from his phone. Even the caterers had paused. Mom? Amber's voice cut through the silence. That's really mean. Victoria shot her daughter a warning look. Stay out of this, Amber. Margaret is just being dramatic as usual. I looked around at the faces watching us, some embarrassed, some curious, some simply enjoying the show. For years, I'd been the family punching bag, the cautionary tale, the sad spinster sister, the one who sacrificed everything only to become nothing. But in that moment, clutching that cruel place card, I realized something that would change everything. Victoria wasn't mocking me because she thought I was a failure. She was doing it because she needed me to be a failure. She needed someone to feel superior to, someone who made all her shallow achievements seem meaningful by comparison, and more importantly, I knew something that Victoria didn't. Something that would turn her perfectly arranged table upside down. You know what, Victoria? I said, placing the card back on the table. Let's eat. I'm starving. Victoria looked momentarily confused by my sudden change in tone, but quickly recovered, plastering on her hostess' smile. Yes, everyone please take your seats. Margaret, you don't mind sitting over there, do you? I smiled back, a real smile, for the first time that day. Not at all, Vicky. It's the perfect place for me to watch everything unfold. She frowned slightly at my cryptic response, but turned to welcome the rest of the guests to the table. Little did she know, this Easter, dinner would be unlike any other. The truth I'd been keeping to myself for years was about to come to light, and Victoria's world of careful pretense was about to crumble like the shell of a decorated Easter egg. I took my seat at the table marked the failure and waited for my moment. The first course arrived, a delicate spring salad with edible flowers that looked too perfect to eat. Victoria beamed as her guests complimented her exquisite taste. I picked at my food, watching the dynamics around the table. Margaret, Mrs. Henderson called from across the table. Victoria tells me you're still at the library. How quaint to have stayed in one job for so long. Before I could respond, Victoria jumped in. Margaret has always preferred stability. The way she said it made stability sound like a terminal disease. Not everyone needs to chase promotions and status, I replied evenly. Libraries are important community pillars. Victoria laughed, that tinkling laugh she reserved for dismissing me. Oh yes, we're all grateful for people like Margaret who keep the institutions running. Richard raised his glass. To the backbone of society. The table laughed and I felt my cheeks burn. They weren't toasting me, they were mocking me. Aunt Margaret helped me with my thesis research, Amber interjected suddenly. She found sources no one else could locate. Victoria shot her daughter a look. Yes, well, speaking of success, Richard just closed that commercial property deal in Charleston. And just like that, I was erased from the conversation. As they droned on about vacation homes and private schools, I observed Victoria carefully. Behind her perfect hostess smile, I noticed the tightness around her eyes, the way she kept glancing at Richard when he mentioned their recent purchases. During a lull between courses, I excused myself to use the restroom. Taking the long way, back I passed Richard's home office. The door was ajar, and voices drifted out. Richard and Jonathan in heated discussion. Dad, I can't keep lying to the bank examiner, Jonathan hissed. Lower your voice, Richard snapped. It's just until we secure the new investors. The properties are underwater. If anyone looks closely, no one will if you keep your mouth shut. Your mother and I have everything under control. I slipped away as they approached the door. So the perfect facade was cracking. Victoria's real estate empire was built on sand. Returning to the table, I noticed Victoria's brittle smile as she described their planned European summer vacation. My mind flashed to the text she'd sent last week. Margaret, we need to have a serious family discussion at Easter. Don't disappoint us by not showing up. Now I understood what this dinner was really about. They needed something from me. The main course arrived, an elaborate rack of lamb that Victoria made sure everyone knew had been specially imported. Margaret, Victoria said suddenly, topping off my wine glass uninvited. You've been so quiet. Tell everyone about your hobby. My hobby was what Victoria called my volunteer work with refugee resettlement. Complex, challenging work that gave me far more purpose than Victoria's country club memberships. Actually, I said, taking a deliberate sip of wine, I've been thinking about Mom and Dad lately. Victoria stiffened. Easter isn't the time for sad memories. Not sad, I corrected. I was remembering how proud Dad was when I received that offer from the publishing house in New York. Victoria's smile faltered. The job I'd turned down to care for our parents was a sore spot she avoided mentioning. Ancient history. Victoria. Dismissed. Funny thing about history, I replied. It shapes everything that follows. Mrs. Blake turned to me with interest. You were in publishing? Margaret had an opportunity once, Victoria cut in, but she chose a different path. I chose family, I said simply. Dad had his stroke, Mom couldn't manage alone, and Victoria was busy with her new marriage. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Family always comes first, Richard said heartily, raising his glass again. Which reminds me, Victoria and I have a small announcement. Here it comes, I thought. We're thinking of converting the old boathouse property into a family retreat, Victoria added quickly. A place where we can all gather for holidays. We'll need all hands on deck for this project. I translated silently. They needed money, and they expected me to contribute. Jonathan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Amber studied her plate. How? Generous of you to include us all, I said carefully. Victoria's eyes gleamed with triumph, mistaking my response for agreement. She had no idea that I had already seen through their charade. More importantly, she had no idea what I'd been building, while she was busy looking down on me. As the dessert plates were cleared, I prepared myself. The real Easter revelation was about to begin. "Coffee in the living room," Victoria announced, rising from the table with practiced grace. "Margaret, would you mind helping with the cups?" I nodded and followed her into the kitchen. The moment we were alone, her facade slipped. "You could try harder, you know," she hissed, violently arranging cookies on a silver tray. "The Hendersons and Blakes are important connections." "Important for what?" "Victoria, you're failing business?" She froze, a cookie suspended midair. "What are you talking about?" "I overheard Richard and Jonathan. Things aren't as perfect as you're pretending, are they?" Victoria slammed the tray down. "Keep your voice down, and stay out of things you don't understand." "I understand perfectly. That's why I'm here, isn't it? Not for a family Easter, but because you need something." She straightened, composing herself. "We're planning to discuss a family investment opportunity, yes. As your only family, I'd think you'd want to help. Like you helped when Mom and Dad needed care?" The words came out sharper than I intended, reopening an old wound. Victoria's face hardened. "We had young children, Margaret. You were single, with nothing tying you down. Nothing except dreams, ambitions, a job offer that would have changed my life." "Just bring the sugar bowl," Victoria snapped, whisking the tray away. Alone in the kitchen, I leaned against the counter, my mind racing. I'd spent years being Victoria's doormat, the family failure, the spinster sister who sacrificed everything, and got nothing in return. But what Victoria didn't know, what none of them knew, was how I'd spent these last 7 years since our parents passed. I'd started small, selling handcrafted bookmarks online while working at the library. My literary-themed designs caught on, and soon I was shipping internationally. I expanded to personalized leather journals, then rare book restoration services. Working with collectors led me to discover I had a talent for spotting undervalued first editions. By the 3rd year, Margot's Literary Treasures had a 6-month waiting list. I'd kept my success quiet, partly because I enjoyed my privacy, but mostly because I knew Victoria would somehow claim credit or demand a share. I carried the sugar bowl into the living room where Richard was already discussing their investment opportunity in vague, grandiose terms. "The lakefront property market is exploding," he was saying. "With the right capital influx, this boathouse renovation could triple in value." "Sounds exciting," Mrs. Henderson replied, though her tone suggested she'd heard similar pitches before. Victoria patted the seat beside her. "Margaret, come sit. This concerns you too." I sat, arranging my face into what I hoped looked like polite interest. "As I was explaining," Richard continued, "this is really a family legacy project. Something for all of us to enjoy, but also a smart investment." "And how much capital are you looking for?" I asked innocently. The room grew quieter. Victoria shot Richard a warning glance. "Well," he cleared his throat, "we're thinking about $50,000 from each family member." Mr. Blake whistled. "That's substantial." "It's an investment," Victoria insisted. "And family rates for using the property once it's renovated." "So it's not actually a family retreat," I clarified. "It's a rental property you want us to fund." Richard's smile stiffened. "Margaret, you of all people should appreciate this opportunity. With your limited resources, where else could you get this kind of return?" I felt a familiar burn of humiliation, followed by something new, a cold, clarifying anger. "And what if I don't have $50,000 to invest?" I asked. Victoria's laugh was brittle. "Oh, Margaret, we know you've been squirreling away money for years. You have no expenses, no children's tuition, no mortgage. No life, she meant. Nothing worth spending on. Maybe Aunt Margaret has other plans for her savings," Amber suggested quietly. Victoria shot her a look. "What plans? She's been doing the same thing for decades." That was the moment I decided. They'd pushed me too far, for too long. The place card was just the final insult. Actually, I said, setting down my coffee cup with deliberate care, I do have other plans. What, another library conference in Duluth? Victoria smirked. No. I met her gaze steadily. I'm opening a rare books gallery in Manhattan next month. The silence was absolute. Victoria's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. Your what? Richard finally managed. A gallery, for rare books and literary artifacts. I've leased space in Chelsea. Victoria recovered first. That's absurd. You can't afford Manhattan real estate. You can barely afford your apartment. I smiled. You'd be surprised what I can afford, Victoria. Jonathan leaned forward, suddenly interested. Aunt Margaret, are you serious? Completely. The opening reception is May 15th. You're all invited, of course. Victoria's face flushed. You're making this up to avoid helping the family. I reached for my phone, pulled up the website, and slid it across to Jonathan. See for yourself. He scrolled through the elegant site showcasing the renovations, the catalog of rare first editions, press mentions of Margot Blackwell, literary antiquarian to watch. Holy shit, he whispered. This is legit. Victoria snatched the phone, her expression shifting from disbelief to shock to something I'd never seen before. Uncertainty. I don't understand, she stammered. How did you? When did you? While you were busy feeling superior, I said quietly. I built something of my own. The Hendersons and Blakes exchanged glances, clearly enjoying this unexpected drama. Well, Mrs. Blake said brightly, Margaret, this is fascinating. I'd love to hear more about your gallery. And just like that, the attention of the room shifted. For the first time in decades, Victoria wasn't the center of the conversation. Her perfect Easter gathering was no longer about showcasing her success or securing funding for her failing investments. As I described my journey into rare books, I caught Amber's eye. She gave me a small, approving smile. Victoria sat frozen, her world tilting on its axis. The bomb I'd dropped was just the beginning. I hadn't even shared the biggest revelation yet. The mood in the living room had shifted dramatically. Mrs. Henderson was now sitting beside me, asking detailed questions about first editions and authentication processes. Mr. Blake discussed potential tax advantages of art investments. I answered thoughtfully. 7 years of expertise flowing naturally. Victoria sat rigidly on the edge of her seat, her smile frozen in place. Richard kept checking his phone, perspiration visible on his forehead. Their perfect Easter gathering was unraveling before their eyes. So this business, Victoria finally interjected, her voice overly casual, it must be very small scale. A hobby shop, really. I took a slow sip of my coffee. Last year, we handled the private sale of a first edition Hemingway for $340,000. Jonathan nearly choked on his cookie. You sold a book for more than my condo cost? Books are just the beginning, I explained. Literary artifacts, handwritten manuscripts, authors' personal effects. There's a passionate market for tangible pieces of literary history. Margot's Literary Treasures, Mrs. Blake read from my website on Jonathan's phone. Margot? Not Margaret? My professional name, I said. It felt right for a fresh start. Victoria stood abruptly. Dessert! I forgot the special Easter pastries. Her voice was too high, her movements jerky as she fled to the kitchen. Richard leaned forward. Margaret, this sounds interesting. Perhaps we should discuss combining our ventures. Your book business could be a perfect addition to our boathouse project. A rare books corner and a vacation rental? I raised an eyebrow. We could position it as a literary retreat, he pressed, desperation seeping through. Your expertise, our property, its synergy. I almost pitied him. I don't think our business models align, Richard, Victoria returned, balancing an elaborate tray of pastries. Her hands were shaking slightly. Margaret has always been full of surprises, she said with a brittle laugh. Remember when she announced she was turning down the New York job to stay with Mom and Dad? We were all shocked. I remember you being relieved, I countered quietly. You told me, thank God someone's handling it. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Well, Mrs. Henderson said brightly, families are complicated, aren't they? Margaret, I'd love to see your gallery when it opens. Victoria's knuckles whitened around her coffee cup. For decades, she'd been the successful sister, the one with connections, the one everyone admired. Now her carefully constructed narrative was crumbling. Actually, I said, reaching for my handbag, I have something else I wanted to discuss while we're all together. Victoria's eyes narrowed with suspicion. More surprises, Margaret? You could say that. I pulled out a slim envelope. I wasn't going to do this today, but after seeing that place card, I think it's time. What place card? Mrs. Blake asked innocently. Victoria laughed nervously. Just a silly mix-up with the seating arrangements. Amber crossed her arms. Mom labeled Aunt Margaret's seat the failure. The Hendersons exchanged shocked glances. Mrs. Blake's mouth fell open. It was clearly a joke, Victoria insisted, her cheeks flushing. Margaret knows that. Do I? I opened the envelope slowly. 7 years ago, after Mom and Dad passed, I found something in Dad's study. Letters, documents, and his original will. Richard set down his drink with a thud. Victoria had the will. It was executed properly. Victoria had a will, I corrected. Not the final one. The room went absolutely still. Victoria's face drained of color. What are you talking about? Her voice was barely audible. I removed a folded document from the envelope. Dad changed his will 3 months before he died. He was concerned about how you and Richard were handling money, about the risky investments, the mounting debt. That's absurd, Richard sputtered. Your father trusted my financial acumen. Did he? I unfolded the paper. This will left the house and half of his assets to me, with specific instructions that they not be used to bail out Victoria and Richard's business ventures. Victoria lunged for the document. This is a fabrication. You're making this up because you're jealous. I held it away from her grasp. It's certified, Victoria. I've had it verified by 2 separate attorneys. Then why wait 7 years? Richard demanded, his voice rising. If this were real, you'd have contested immediately. I almost did, I admitted. But then I thought about what Dad would want. He valued family peace above all. So I decided to make my own way, build something without relying on inheritance. How noble, Victoria sneered, but her voice quavered. It wasn't nobility, I said. It was self-preservation. I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't what you always thought I was. A failure. Jonathan looked between his mother and me, confusion evident. So this house, it's actually yours? Legally, yes, but I've never intended to claim it. Then why bring this up now? Victoria demanded. I carefully refolded the document. Because I'm tired of being treated like a charity case when you're the ones who've been living in a house that rightfully belongs to me. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria stared at me as if seeing a stranger. In many ways, she was. The docile, self-sacrificing sister she'd taken for granted no longer existed. I don't want the house, I continued. What I want is respect. And an apology for years of condescension and today's deliberate humiliation. Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. Richard looked physically ill. The Hendersons and Blakes were watching with undisguised fascination. If this is true, Richard finally said, you could have evicted us at any time. I could have, I agreed. But unlike some people, I don't measure my worth by how much power I hold over others. In that moment, looking at Victoria's stunned face, I realized something profound. I was free. Free from needing her approval. Free from the burden of being the family failure. Free from the shadow that had followed me for decades. And Victoria? For perhaps the first time in her life, she was speechless. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6 times, breaking the suffocating silence. The Hendersons and Blakes exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly uncertain whether to stay for the unfolding family drama or make a polite exit. "Perhaps we should," Mrs. Henderson began, half rising from her seat. "No, please stay," Victoria said quickly, her social mask sliding back into place with visible effort. "This is just a misunderstanding between sisters." "Is it?" I asked quietly. "Because it seems pretty clear to me." Richard cleared his throat. "Margaret, perhaps we should discuss this privately." "Why? You were fine humiliating me publicly." I turned toward our guests. "I apologize that you've been drawn into this. Actually," Mr. Blake said, setting down his coffee cup, "I find it rather refreshing. Too many families hide their dysfunction behind closed doors." Victoria let out a strangled sound somewhere between a laugh and a gasp. "Mom," Amber said, her voice gentle but firm, "I think you owe Aunt Margaret an apology." Victoria's head snapped toward her daughter. "Excuse me?" "The place card was cruel," Amber continued. "And from what I'm hearing, it's part of a pattern." Jonathan, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. "Is that why Grandpa changed his will? Because of how you treated Aunt Margaret?" Victoria's face flushed. "Your grandfather was confused in his final months. Margaret has clearly taken advantage." "Stop it, Victoria," I interrupted suddenly, exhausted by the decades of lies. "I have the letter Dad wrote explaining his decision. Would you like me to read it aloud?" Victoria's mouth snapped shut. I pulled out another document from my envelope. "This is just between us, but since you're questioning my integrity—" "Fine," Victoria whispered, slumping slightly in her chair. "You've made your point." Richard, however, wasn't ready to surrender. "If this is some kind of blackmail to get us to invest in your bookshop—" "Gallery," I corrected. "And I don't need your investment. My business secured Series A funding last month. Our valuation is $12 million. Richard's jaw literally dropped. Jonathan let out a low whistle. "That's impossible," Victoria muttered. "You're a librarian." "I was a librarian," I clarified. "Now I'm the founder and CEO of a rapidly growing literary auction house and authentication service." Mrs. Blake leaned forward with new interest. $12 million? "Margaret, you must tell me who handled your funding round. My daughter's tech startup is looking for investors." For the first time in our adult lives, I watched Victoria experience something she'd never known before. Irrelevance. The spotlight had shifted completely away from her, and she had no idea how to reclaim it. "There's more," I said, turning back to Victoria and Richard. "Dad left me something else, a letter explaining why he changed his will." I unfolded a yellowed page covered in our father's distinctive handwriting. "My dearest Margaret," I began reading. "If you're seeing this, I've passed on, and you've discovered the changes to my will. I need you to understand why." Victoria stood abruptly. "This is private family business." "Sit down, Victoria," I said firmly. "You've controlled the narrative long enough." To my surprise, she sank back into her seat. "For years," I continued reading, "I've watched you sacrifice your dreams to care for your mother and me. Victoria has always taken what she wanted, but you have given what was needed. She may appear successful on the surface, but I fear her foundation is built on sand." Richard shifted uncomfortably. Victoria stared at the floor. "The house should rightfully be yours," I read. "But knowing you, you may choose not to contest Victoria's claim. If that's your decision, I respect it. But know this. Your mother and I were always proudest of you, not because of what you achieved, but because of who you are. My voice cracked slightly on the last words. I carefully refolded the letter, slipping it back into my bag. Dad knew, I said softly. He knew what you did with the will, Victoria, but he also knew I wouldn't fight you for it. Why not? Jonathan asked, genuinely curious. Why let them have everything? I considered the question, because I needed to prove something to myself, that I could build a life without riding on anyone's coattails or depending on inheritance. So noble, Victoria muttered, but there was less venom in her voice now. Not noble, I corrected, necessary, for my own peace. Amber stood up and crossed the room to sit beside me. I think what you did was incredibly brave, Aunt Margaret. Building something from nothing. Victoria's head snapped up, her eyes flashing, with hurt at her daughter's apparent betrayal. It wasn't nothing, I said. I had an education, experience, and skills. Many people start with far less. And now? Richard asked, his business mind clearly calculating. What do you intend to do with this information about the will? The question hung in the air. It was the moment of truth. I could demand the house. Force them out. Expose Victoria's deception to everyone in their social circle. I looked around the room, at the renovations that had erased our childhood memories, at Victoria's desperate, fearful expression, at the curious faces of the Hendersons, and Blake's. Nothing, I said finally. Nothing? Victoria echoed in disbelief. I don't want the house, Victoria. I've built my own life, my own success. What I want is acknowledgement, truth. After decades of being treated as less than, I want you to admit what you did. The room held its breath. Victoria looked trapped, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. Victoria, Richard murmured. Just tell her. She looked at her husband with something like betrayal, then back at me. Our eyes locked, sister to sister, beyond the facades and the pretenses. I took it, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I found... Dad's new will and I hid it, Amber gasped softly. The confession hung in the air, stark and irreversible. Why? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Victoria's perfect composure finally cracked. Because I was drowning, she said, tears welling in her eyes. The business was failing. We were leveraged to the hilt. I couldn't bear the thought of losing everything while you... While I what? While you judged me with that quiet superiority. Of yours. The words burst out of her. You and your noble sacrifices, your simple life. Everyone always admired you for it, even while pitying you. Don't you see how maddening that was? And finally, after all these years, I understood. Victoria hadn't hated me for being a failure. She'd hated me for possessing something she never could. Authenticity. A heavy silence settled over the room after Victoria's confession. Tears streamed down her face, her perfect makeup now smudged. For the first time in our adult lives, I was seeing my sister without her mask, vulnerable, frightened, and very human. I think we should be going, Mrs. Henderson finally said, gathering her purse. The Blakes nodded in agreement. Yes, of course, Victoria responded automatically, years of social training kicking in despite her emotional state. Thank you so much for coming. The goodbyes were awkward but mercifully brief. Within minutes, only family remained in the living room. Richard looked shell-shocked, alternating between checking his phone and staring at the wall. Amber sat close, to me, while Jonathan hovered near the doorway as if planning his escape. So what happens now? Richard finally asked, his voice hoarse. I closed my eyes briefly, feeling the weight of the moment. This crossroads had been decades in the making. Whatever I decided would forever change our family. Victoria, I said quietly. Do you remember what Mom used to say about grudges? Victoria looked up, surprise flickering across her tear-stained face. That they're like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die. I nodded. Exactly. Are you saying you forgive me? Victoria sounded incredulous. Just like that? After what I did? Forgiveness isn't about erasing the past, I said. It's about refusing to let it control the future. I paused, gathering my thoughts. I'm not saying what you did was okay. It wasn't. But I'm tired of this poison between us. So you'll just forget it all? Richard asked suspiciously. No, I said firmly. I won't forget, and there need to be changes. Real ones. Victoria wiped her eyes, smudging her mascara further. What kind of changes? First, the truth. No more pretending. No more family failure. Narratives. Victoria nodded slowly. And the house? The will? The house isn't what matters to me, I said. But honesty does. If you want to stay here, we need to formalize it. A proper agreement acknowledging that I'm legally allowing you to remain in a property that's rightfully mine. Richard stiffened. You want us to be your tenants? I want clarity, I corrected. And boundaries. No more taking advantage. Victoria's shoulders slumped. We can't afford to buy you out. I'm not asking you to, but I am asking for respect. And the boathouse project? Richard ventured. Is off the table, I said firmly. It was clearly just a scheme to get money from family members. Jonathan exhaled loudly. Thank God. I told them it was a terrible investment. What about your gallery opening? Amber asked quietly. Will we still be invited? I looked at my niece, seeing genuine interest in her eyes. Of course, all of you. I don't know if I can face your success, Victoria admitted, her voice small. Not after everything. That's your choice, I said, but I'd rather move forward than stay stuck in our old patterns. Victoria looked at me then, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in years. When did you get so wise? A smile tugged at my lips. Probably while everyone was underestimating me. To my surprise, Victoria let out a broken laugh. I deserved that. Yes, I agreed. You did. Richard cleared his throat. So what about our financial situation? We're still in trouble. That's not Margaret's problem, Amber said sharply, surprising everyone. No, it's not, I agreed. But I can recommend some legitimate financial advisors who might help you restructure. Victoria stared at me in wonder. You would do that? After everything? I'm not doing it for you, I clarified. I'm doing it for me, because I don't want to live with resentment anymore. I stood up, suddenly eager to leave this house with its suffocating memories. I should go. It's been a long day. Victoria rose too. Margaret, She stopped, seeming at a loss for words. Then, to my complete astonishment, she stepped forward and embraced me awkwardly. I'm sorry, she whispered. Truly sorry. I stiffened at first, then slowly returned the hug. It felt foreign, uncomfortable, but also strangely healing. I know, I said simply. As I gathered my things to leave, Amber approached. I'd love to see your gallery sometime before the opening. Maybe we could have lunch? I'd like that, I replied, feeling a warmth I hadn't expected. Jonathan shuffled forward. The gallery sounds cool, Aunt Margaret. Maybe I could. I don't know, help out somehow? I'm pretty good with computers. I studied my nephew, seeing past the privileged exterior to someone possibly searching for purpose. Come by next week. We'll talk. Richard remained distant, nodding curtly as I passed. Some bridges would take longer to rebuild, if they ever could be. At the door, Victoria stopped me. The place card, she said quietly. It was cruel and childish. I wanted to hurt you because I was afraid you'd see through me. I know, I replied. You're not a failure, Margaret. You never were. I smiled, a genuine smile that felt like release. No, I'm not, and I never needed you to tell me that, but it's nice to hear anyway. Stepping outside into the cool evening air, I took a deep breath. The weight I'd carried for decades, the resentment, the hurt, the need for validation, felt lighter somehow. Tomorrow, I would return to my gallery preparations. I would continue building the life I'd chosen, not defined by Victoria's judgment or my parents' legacy, but by my own values and choices. I walked to my car, turning once to look back at the house. Victoria stood in the doorway watching me, a complex mix of emotions on her face. I raised my hand in a small wave, which she returned after a moment's hesitation. Some wounds might never fully heal, but the poison of silence had finally been drawn out. The table card marked the failure had led to an unexpected triumph, the freedom to be myself, completely and without apology. As I drove away from my childhood home, I wasn't leaving with bitterness or regret. I was moving forward with something far more valuable. The quiet power of a woman who had finally claimed her worth. The sun was setting as I reached the highway, casting long shadows across the road ahead. But for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what lay in the darkness. I had built a light of my own, and it would guide me home.